Coming up on this episode of the All Aboard podcast, we talk about the various advocacy organizations that support the rail industry in the U.S. Capitol, in your state houses, and at City Hall. Have your tickets out of the envelope. All aboard, please. Now boarding on track number 8 is train number 1, the All Aboard podcast, your twice-weekly excursion into transportation excellence, and I am your conductor, Phil Bell, Enterprise B. PB Crisp, Mr. 645, a highly trained rail enthusiast who one day may, hopefully, kinda, sorta, I don't know, could become a highly trained broadcast specialist. And I am blessed to hold the E. Hunter Harrison Chair here at the Bell Institute for Advanced Railroad Studies, where there are no degrees because the learning never ceases. And it is great to be back behind this, the Brunswick Green PLB microphone. So, this week is Railroad Day on Capitol Hill, and you're probably wondering, but Phil, what is Railroad Day on Capitol Hill? It sounds like a great time. Well, it is, and it's actually very interesting because that's how I got introduced to the rail industry in person in many ways. Railroad Day on Capitol Hill, which will take place this coming Wednesday, May 8th, is the annual fly-in. And fly-in is kind of a funny term here because, of course, we're railroad people. Why are we talking about flying in? But it is the annual fly-in where we bring railroad companies, rail employees, shippers, and a lot of other folks associated with the industry, including advocates, to Capitol Hill to talk to members of Congress and their staffs about how the railroad operates and what the issues are that the industries have. Now, this is the fly-in that happens for the industry nationally, and it's led by the American Shortline and Regional Railroad Association. But there are also a myriad of fly-ins that happen at the state level in the various state houses across the country that the state railroad associations lead. Now, why are we talking about this? Well, first of all, because railroads and elected officials go way back all the way to the beginning. After all, it was the state legislatures in places like Maryland and South Carolina, Pennsylvania, and so forth that gave the charters for the first railroads to operate. So invariably, once you were going to put track down and start to run a train over it, the government was going to be involved. But then as railroads started to grow, you started to see a more intrusive approach to railroading. And that came in a variety of forms. First of all, we all know about the land grants that were offered for the construction of Western railroads. In Eastern railroads, for example, when the Atlantic, Mississippi, and Ohio went bankrupt, the Commonwealth of Virginia stepped in and pumped money into it, and that is what created the Norfolk and Western. We also saw the controversies that took place in states like New York and Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania had built the main line of public works, which included a small railroad as part of it, along with canals. The state of New York, of course, the Erie Canal. And then you saw the Commodore Vanderbilts of the world and Tom Scotts and so forth get involved. And this meant the government was going to be more aggressively involved. So at the beginning, it was putting money into the enterprises and chartering them. But as time went on, it went to regulating them. There were several transportation acts which gave rise to the Interstate Commerce Commission and also the powers that the ICC had to set rates and dictate service levels. This, of course, became an albatross around the necks of the railroads. And so that meant they wanted to take a different approach. Now, as this different approach, of course, was being taken, you saw a lot of what typically happens when government gets involved with anything, and that is what we call corruption. So, of course, there are many instances where you will hear about railroad officials of the past having bribed Senator so-and-so or Congressman so-and-so and so on. And it's not unique to railroading. It happens in every industry, and it happens in every government, regardless of who is involved politically. But as we know, as you got to the 1950s, things came to a head where you had a lot of railroads starting to really struggle financially, and the finger was pointed at what had been a problem for railroads for many years, which was the regulatory approach. Now, I want to go to somebody who we know very well here at the All Aboard podcast, and that is none other than Al Pearlman. Al Pearlman did a couple of videos, The Big Train and The Big Train Part 2, and these are actually films for the time where he talked about the railroad, his railroad, of course, the New York Central, but the railroad in general, how it works. And I want to show a little bit of Part 2, where he talks about how government had become probably a little too much, as he might say, too deeply involved in how the railroad ran. And here you go.
But that is only half the story. I'd like to tell you the other half myself. But first, a question. How would you like to run a business if the government used your tax dollars to build one alongside you, then made it tax-free and turned it over to a competitor, and helped him operate and maintain it? That is the problem of the railroad. Now let me go back a little in railroad history. In the 19th century, the railroads had a virtual monopoly of inland transportation. Regulation of the railroads grew up with that monopoly in mind. They were necessary laws. Indeed, they made sense. Half a century ago, today these laws still control railroad operations. But what happened to our monopoly? Is it in the passenger transportation? Is it in hauling freight? Well, what happened to our monopoly? As all of us...
And so you can see there, that is when things got to be more than a little uncomfortable. And as we know from the history, by that point, the New York Central was in many ways functionally bankrupt or close to it. And so Al Perlman was doing yeoman's work to help try to dig the company out of the problems that it was in. Now, during this time, though, the railroads were not bereft of the ability to make their voice heard, and we've talked about in a variety of podcast episodes, and so I just encourage you to go back and watch a number of them, whether they're related to Conrail or Penn Central, activist investors, and otherwise, which includes a variety of elements of the way that railroads would make their case known to government and talk about the various issues. So today, I want to talk about, now that we have a little bit of historical context on what railroad advocacy, railroad legislation, and railroad regulation did encompass, let's talk about the organizations that today advocate for the railroads. The first, of course, is the best known, and that is the Association of American Railroads. And we have right here the biography for Ian Jeffries, who leads the AAR. Now, the AAR has been the oldest, the most prominent, and what they do is a variety of things. First of all is the advocacy. They send members of their team, including Mr. Jeffries, up to Congress to talk with them, and it's frequently congressional staff who actually make a lot of the decisions, but send there to talk to them about the issues that are pertinent to what's going on. Today, that includes diesel locomotive emissions. It includes crew sizes. It also includes the omnipresent threat of railroad economic re-regulation. So Ian Jeffries leads the charge there. And now he is a very interesting individual because Ian, before he came to lead the Association of American Railroads, he was a senior staff member with West Virginia Senator Jay Rockefeller. And Jay Rockefeller had an interesting history himself as it went to railroading, because in the 1980s, he actually saved a line from being abandoned that was operated by the Baltimore and Ohio, by then the Chessie system, and he created the South Branch Valley Railroad while he was governor of the state of West Virginia. And that connects Romney, Moorfield, and Petersburg, West Virginia, with CSX's former Baltimore and Ohio main line between Washington, D.C. and Pittsburgh. However, by the 2010s, late 2000 and early 2010, Senator Rockefeller had become the biggest antagonist of railroads because he was pushing economic re-regulation legislation. And what that would have done was rolled back key provisions of the Staggers Rail Act of 1980 and would have encouraged the Surface Transportation Board, not mandated, but encouraged them to then go back and set rates and service levels for a variety of commodity groups, and ultimately all of them. So this shows the approach the railroads are taking to regulatory policy and legislative policy, which is to make sure that you have somebody who very much understands the process and the people and has the relationships so that their message can get out. And the reason why I want to highlight this is because a lot of the discussion around lobbying and advocacy frequently turns toxic. And I know I've been one of the people who helped make it toxic when I was living outside of this area, in a variety of different places around the country, because I listened to what they said on the news, which is that lobbying is all about people going in, quote unquote, special interests, and and making whatever deals it is that they want to make with legislators who are always happy to listen and always happy to do whatever it is that they want because the special interests have money. But in reality, what it really does take is building a lot of person-to-person relationships that go on for a long time. And Ian Jeffries is a good example of that, because being on the other side of the issue and working for a boss that had a very big concern about the way railroads were operating and the rates that they were charging, particularly with respect to coal, because coal then was big in West Virginia, as it is now, but the transportation by rail was substantially larger. And coal was also in decline. So a lot of the producers there were fighting a two-front war. On one hand, they were fighting against the federal government that was and state governments who were trying to move away from power generation by coal, using coal. At the other hand, they were also fighting with railroads who were raising rates, but the railroads were raising rates from an extraordinarily low position. And even with the rate increases that they imposed during the 2000s, those rates came nowhere near close to being anything like the rates that were being charged before deregulation. And the railroads, just like the coal shippers and receivers, has a need to earn a substantial amount of profit in order to support what are high capital intensive industrial businesses. So that's the reason why you have Ian Jeffries here. Now, the Association of American Railroads is largely populated by your Class 1 rail carriers, but in recent years that has grown. And so its current full members are the Alaska Railroad, which is certainly a regional, not only a regional, but it's an intrastate regional that's in Alaska. The railroads owned by Anacostia Holdings, which include the South Shore, the New York and Atlantic, the Louisville and Indiana, as among others. The BNSF Railway, Canadian National, Canadian Pacific, Kansas City, CSX Transportation. Those are all Class 1 carriers, of course. Florida East Coast Railway. The properties of the Genesee and Wyoming, which are a variety of short lines all across the country. The Indiana Railroad, Iowa Interstate, Metra, which is the commuter agency in the Chicago area. National Railroad Passenger Corporation, of course, we better know that as Amtrak. Norfolk Southern Railway, yet another Class 1. The R.J. Corman Rail Carriers, Union Pacific, the final Class 1 there. Vermont Rail System, Watco, and the Wheeling and Lake Erie. So all of those are the full members. Now, they have some affiliate members, such as Cleveland Cliffs, that has its own railroad operations around Cleveland, New Jersey Transit, Metro North, Delta Southern, and several others. And like many of these advocacy organizations, they have members who are manufacturers and suppliers, such as Cummins, Progress Rail, and Railworks. Now, there's a full listing, which we've included in the description here so that you can grab that. Now, the Association of American Railroads also owns Rail Inc., which provides a variety of services to the railroads, including the UMLER, which is the University Machine Language Equipment Roster, and that's the registry for all railroad equipment. So when you think about reporting marks, that's where the reporting marks assigned by the Association of American Railroads as well as part of the UMLER. They also assign frequencies for radio operations. So when you're using your scanner, if you're a rail enthusiast, you're out there and you're tuning to AAR channel 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on, well, the AAR and the AAR channels comes from the Association of American Railroads. Now, they also make a voluminous amount of reports. So they provide data on weekly rail traffic, fuel usage, industry employment, and so on. And all of this information is provided for a variety of people, even if it is targeted toward those on Capitol Hill and in the state capitals that do regulate the way that railroads run. Now, you can go to the AAR site and sign up to receive the weekly traffic data report, which is something I encourage you to do. And going forward, we will be sharing those on allthingstrains.com, which is, of course, your one-stop shop for data on railroads and rail operations. Now, the other thing that the AAR does, which is very interesting, and certainly as rail employees, rail enthusiasts, and so on, has impacted the way that we've worked, is they've developed standards for rail equipment. And one example of that is the famous, what's called the Association of American Railroads Type B truck. Now, in reality, these types, Type A, Type B, and so forth, were never, realistically used in the field. People just kind of know them as trucks, or they'll call them by the manufacturer, Alco, or whomever built the locomotive. But one example is right here, And this is a set of those trucks under a Milwaukee Road GP30 that would not normally have been built with them, but they were built as using trade-in parts from, I believe, Alco RS1s. But that is an example of what the AAR does, which is to help develop a lot of the equipment that is needed, set standards for that, and so on. And the reason why is because railroads, of course, interchange. If we do everything one way on fill rail and you do everything differently on another railroad, and you do it in a way that they cannot interact, then the sanctity of the national railroad system would be broken. Now, in some cases, this does happen, but by and large, the reason why we have the fluidity of equipment and so on isn't by government fiat. It's actually because of the Association of American Railroads working together with all of the carriers and serving as that clearinghouse where they can come together and say, hey, we need to get things from point A to point B. How can we do that? And this is what enables it. So the AAR is a critically important aspect of the rail industry. The second is one that is very near and dear to me, and I'm going to start off, for those of you who are on CP5 cam, by showing you something that I have actually never seen in person, and that is the Go Rail EMD SD60E that was painted by Norfolk Southern, who actually owns the locomotive. Now, Go Rail is a nonprofit organization that is closely associated with the Association of American Railroads, and what it does is engages in grassroots engagement to help state and local elected officials, which we call grass tops, to better understand how the rail industry works. In addition to the state and local elected officials, they also work with a variety of unelected officials, such as the people who lead metropolitan planning organizations and those in the business community, to also have a good on-ramp to working with the railroads and the rail industry itself. Now, this is focused on freight rail. And what I did with Go Rail is I was a state director for New Jersey, Maryland, Delaware, Virginia, Missouri, and Minnesota. And so what I did is went around to meet a lot of these elected officials, talk to them about what was going on with the railroad in their area in terms of the investments that were being made, in terms of the operations that were being conducted, and worked with them to gain their support in opposition to the potential railroad re-regulation legislation that was floated variously by Senator Rockefeller and several others. So I worked there from 2008 to 2011, and it was a very eye-opening experience, because it's one thing to look at the railroad as somebody who is either buying a railroad and being employed by a railroad, or working in the industry in some form, and then having the ability to see it as some from the standpoint of those who run the communities that the railroad serves. Now, this is not to say that the railroads are doing poorly or anything of that sort. Very much the contrary. In fact, it was so interesting that while it seems like most people, when you start talking about trains, are kind of like, I don't know anything about that. I don't see why you're talking about trains, or Phil, stop talking about trains. You see a lot of the elected officials and the people with the MPOs and other organizations very much understanding what the railroad does in their community and how critical it is, and then being willing to have good dialogue about what needed to be changed in order so that the railroad could be better neighbors in some cases, or be more effective in serving some of the businesses that were either growing or wanted to grow in the area. So while we had the strict mission of talking about several key issues, in many ways we became conduits to help connect the railroads with some of these outside stakeholders. Now, to be clear, we were not the railroads' representatives in these areas. The railroads themselves have representatives, and those are called, at least on the Class 1 carriers, resident vice presidents, and they will have resident VPs for each state, and those individuals will frequently be working out of the state house, or near the state house, I should say, not out of the state house, but nearby the state house, so that they can build the same relationships with state elected officials and bureaucrats as we do at the federal level with the Association of American Railroads and the American Short Line and Regional Railroad Association. Go Rail is a great organization. My friend Emily Treforis, who we mentioned a few episodes back, been there for more than a decade, actually close to 20 years now. And she is just one of many people with that team, Russ McGurk and so on, who really do a great thing in terms of getting the word out in ways that had not been done before Go Rail was put together. Now, Following Go Rail, I would like to talk about another one that has become very near and dear to me over the years, and that is the American Short Line and Regional Railroad Association. Now, this organization was one that I came in contact with very early because going to Railroad Day way back in 2007, just kind of hearing about it and saying I need to go and meet some of these folks in person was truly, changed my life. It's a lot of what helped bring me here to the All Aboard podcast and some of my outside work that I do. But the ASLRRA is critical in that they represent the interest of the short line and regional rail carriers. So we're talking about everything from a 1 mile switching carrier that serves a particular plant to something like the Wheeling and Lake Erie or the Buffalo, Rochester, and Pittsburgh. Buffalo and Pittsburgh. Buffalo, Rochester, and Pittsburgh was probably about 100 years ago. Buffalo and Pittsburgh is part of the Genesee and Wyoming. And here are several staff members at the ASLRRA. And at the left there, you see Chuck Baker, who is the president. Chuck has been involved in the industry for just about 20 years as well. And he was involved with a variety of the advocacy organizations before that and had worked in investment banking there. But he leads this organization together with Joe Strang, who focuses on safety and compliance. And in addition to handling the day-to-day advocacy activities for the short line and regional railroads, they also run the Short Line Safety Institute. And this is a comparatively new initiative that helps to bring about best practices on safety among the various short line and regional railroad carriers. Now, it's important to note they aren't needed because the short lines and regionals were somehow unsafe. This was actually more because the short lines and regionals are so much more fractioned than the larger carriers, the class ones. Now, of course, there's only 6 of them, and that means there are a lot of different opportunities for people to have different takes on how to accomplish a particular task. So the ASLRRA, through the Short Line Safety Institute, helps to highlight those procedures that are the best ways and help to spread those among the carriers. It also helps with helping develop procedures for reporting and other activities that are critical from a regulatory standpoint. So this way, if you're a new short line operator and you're getting in the business, or if you're an existing short line operator and you're growing, you have ways to improve your processes thanks to membership in the ASLRRA and the work of the Short Line Safety Institute. So please, I encourage you to go visit those sites as well and take a look at some of the offerings they have there and why they matter. Now, there are a few other organizations that are out there, including the Railway Supply Institute, the American Association of Private Railcar Owners, the Heritage Rail Alliance, and the various state railway associations. All of these, and also, the One Rail Coalition as well. All of these still continue to do the same thing, which is provide representation for a variety of the underlying organizations that support them. So in the case of the Railway Supply Institute, you're talking about your Caterpillars of the world, Cummins, Stella Jones, and so forth. All of these are rail suppliers, and the rail suppliers are critical because without them, it's safe to say we wouldn't have very much railroad anyway. But also, their ability to have their needs heard on Capitol Hill directly impacts the ability of the railroads themselves to operate, because if they're not able to do so and the suppliers can start to decline again, and this is something that has happened over the years, then you will start to see an inability of the rail carriers to operate at reasonable cost structures. So the supply, and that means everything from small locomotive parts to something as large as a passenger car or rails themselves, railroad ties, ballast, you name it, we must be able to acquire it at relatively reasonable costs. If not, the business will grind to a halt. The Heritage Rail Alliance, they represent tourist railroads, and tourist railroads are very much a different animal than even your short line railroads, even though to many people they may look quite a bit similar. But the process of carrying passengers and providing entertainment can be something that gets to be very prickly depending upon where you go. One need look no further than what happened a few years ago with Andy Muller and the Reading and Northern and some of the trains that they were operating into and out of Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania. Jim Thorpe wanted to impose an amusements tax, which is something that does exist in a variety of jurisdictions across the country. And he said, look, I'm not going to pay it. I'm an interstate railroad. Or if not an interstate railroad, a railroad that is regulated and taxed differently from an amusement. And that's an important distinction because, as I recall, the Reading and Northern is not actually an interstate railroad. It is an intrastate railroad, but yet it is regulated differently from an amusement. So this got to be a point of contention. And for a while, he even stopped operating the Lehigh Gorge Scenic Railway trains that were serving Jim Thorpe and bringing a lot of people to what was already a strong tourist community. Another example of what happened in Maryland back in the 1980s, the Intertrainment Line, which operated on a portion of the former Western Maryland, which is now the Maryland Midland. They did not know they had to pay a local amusements tax. And when they were handed the bill for this tax, they found out they couldn't pay that bill, and that ended up shutting that service down and leading to the dispersal of its equipment. So having an organization that is out there to advocate for these tourist railroads as well as museums, whether they be for-profit or nonprofit, is critical in their ability to continue operating and to grow. The American Association of Private Railcar Owners, they are more focused on relationships with the various railroads themselves, but also this does become a public issue because if you're a private railcar owner and you're probably thinking about, well, when I have a ton of money, I'm going to buy a car and tack it onto the end of an Amtrak train, which is perfectly reasonable. But of course, you have to make sure the car meets Amtrak standards and also where you're going to store the car. And if you store the car someplace that is in public view or otherwise, this could then have implications with respect to your municipality or your state, depending upon what the rules are. So you have the American Association of Private Railcar Owners, which is nicknamed APRCO for the acronym, that will advocate on behalf of the private railcar owners. Again, mostly with respect to the railroads with whom they're running over, Amtrak, the Class 1 carriers, and so on. But they also do provide that all-important advocacy function otherwise. So that gives you a little bit of an idea about what the advocacy picture looks like in terms of the rail industry and the various organizations that support it. So what I want you to do, first of all, is go to allthingstrains.com every day, and we will have a list up later this week of all the state railway associations, as well as links to the Association of American Railroads and the other American Short Line and Regional Railroad Association, Go Rail, and the others that we have talked about here. But second, what I want you to do is to follow the ASLRRA to find out when they schedule the 2025 Railroad Day for, and I'd like as many of you to attend it as possible. This is a great way for everyday individuals, and it doesn't matter where you come from, whether you are an elected official, whether you're an employee for the railroad, whether you're a rail enthusiast, or you name it. I want you to come out and do this because it is very helpful for those in Congress to hear and see who actually makes up this industry. Because like any other that's out there, it's very easy for them just to simply say, oh, well, that's big business. And clearly big business wants a handout from us or this, that, or the other, and to either ignore or even be openly hostile. But it is a dramatically different thing when you're bringing someone from your community who is depending upon the railroad, whether for a job, whether it is to make their business viable by moving cargo to and from their loading dock or otherwise, or even providing the infrastructure for commuter rail or intercity passenger rail or tourist rail. It's a lot different when they start to see this and they recognize the impact. And sad it is to say, those who work in Congress have very short memories, not because they're dumb, but because they hear from a lot of different groups every day. So we are just one of many, and that's why we have to continue to make sure to stay in front of them as we do this critical work. So I hope you'll do that, and please follow us at All Things Trains because we will be at Railroad Day, at least for a little while this year. I'm not exactly sure where, but we will be talking about that a little bit more. Also, coming up on Wednesday, which is the 8th of May, we will have an episode where we talk about the final pieces for the Norfolk Southern and Cora proxy fight, which will be taking place the following day on May 9th. So we'll obviously be keeping a running tally and as much information as we can at the All Things Train site about that, because basically one of the Class 1 railroads of this country, control of that is up for grabs, and we're going to see who ends up winning that contest. But we'll keep you posted and have a good conversation of where things stand on Wednesday before the final vote. So thank you for choosing All Things Trains, and we will see you down the main line.